What are some of the most exciting alternative data sets you're seeing today, and how are they being used?
Yep. So, I mentioned the web data. I think that's very exciting. Going beyond that, we've looked at data on sentiment. Now, sentiment's sort of a well-trodden path, natural language processing on text, but we think that there could be applications of NLP and sentiment beyond what's been done previously. So, Twitter sentiment and news sentiment are sort of well known, but we certainly looked at blogger sentiment, for example, with one of our partner firms. And blog sentiment is something that's sort of a unique sort of research content, so you could bring NLP to bear on that. So that's, I think, very exciting. So sort of new twists on things that have already been done. Another one would be looking at cross-asset effects. This is really interesting. People tend to focus just on the equity space, but there's certainly spillovers from other asset classes.
Yeah.
We've done work on showing that there's a spillover from the listed equity option space into the cash equity space. So in other words, you can look at information in those listed equity options and find that in some cases they lead the cash equity market. So that's a very simple example. The data is well structured. It's not terribly exotic, but it's something that not everyone's doing. Not everyone's thinking about these potential linkages.
Okay.
And then the third one that I think is really exciting and is a wide open field is ESG. Right now, certainly there are a ton of ESG mandates out there. There are people using, let's say, MSCI solutions for ESG to solve a problem. This problem is, investors want ESG products, and that's great. But I think ESG can go well beyond, divesting of tobacco companies or measuring carbon emissions or measuring the diversity of a company's board. Can go beyond the company's own disclosures and into, let's say, government disclosures. So what's the government telling you, and what can you find out from filing information? Yeah. So there's a lot of rich information there in the ESG space as well. And this is an interesting case where the use of the data may not be for return prediction. So everything we've talked about so far is forecasting alpha, right? And it's in your company's name, it's in my company's name. But alpha isn't all of what it's about. We think that there are interesting use cases in the risk side.
Yeah.
And ESG is a great example of this. AQR came out with a paper not long ago using MSCI's ESG ratings for risk assessment and finding out that some of the components of E and S and G can be useful for forecasting volatility and managing risk. Great use case. It slots in perfectly with any fund manager's process, anyone who cares about risk, but it is genuinely alternative data. And then the other thing that we like to focus on a lot internally, because we like to have a lot of intuition behind why a data set might be predictive of stock prices, is to take a step back from stock prices and not really predict them directly. A lot of the modeling we do looks at, can we predict something about a company's fundamentals? Yeah. So can we predict, let's say, its revenues next quarter, or its earnings growth, revenue surprise, maybe balance sheet strength? There are a lot of different metrics you can bring to bear that could tell you something about a company's strength or its ability to beat its competitors that don't go directly to stock price. And maybe you don't, ultimately that's all we care about, but there are other ways to get there. So I think looking at data in ways that predicts volatility, earnings events, fundamentals are as important as predicting returns.
And when we think about use cases and looking towards the future, what new use cases can you see evolving over the next couple of years? For example, we define all data across 24 categories, whether it's consumer transactions, satellite, geo. Do you see new categories that might be able to drive new analysis? Or
Sure. Yeah, I think there are a number of interesting potential categories. One of them that I like to draw attention to is a lot of the internal data sets that either the buy side or the sell side have, and they might not be leveraging. On the buy side, very often this means internal analyst reports or recommendations. So you can think of this as sort of internal alpha capture in a way. Or this could even mean mining communications between analysts and portfolio managers and capturing information that might not be captured in their ultimate buys and sells or ratings internally. Yeah. On the sell side, similar idea, looking at broker research. Certainly people have been looking at things like stock borrow information or internal credit ratings. But banks are sitting on a lot of data. Now, there are a lot of compliance issues around that I'm not an expert in, but it's clear that banks have taken an interest in seeing what data assets they have, which they can leverage in the alternative data space. And I think that's going to be a growing area. So I guess in terms of categories, I'd say kind of internal data is a very interesting one, although a not well-defined one.
Yeah, agreed.
And then beyond that, and this isn't a particular category of data, it's more an interesting extension of the use cases. We talked about asset classes. I think alternative data is going to become much more widely adopted in private equity, in VC, in potentially infrastructure and macro. A lot of different strategies will start to adopt whatever types of alternative data might be applicable to them. Real estate's a great example. There's tons of alternative data, and I don't know if any of it's being used very systematically among real estate funds. But private equity and VC are probably really interesting ones in terms of app data or usage data, or in the private equity space, there's a lot of information about mature private companies that may not be widely used by PE funds.
Sure.
If a big PE firm is acquiring a business, they really need to analyze all the data relevant to that business, its competitors, its sectors. Frankly, it's their fiduciary duty, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And companies leave footprints across the market, and not just in their financial statements, but well beyond. So I think alternative data will be a big driver of that market going forward.
And corporates, do you think corporates themselves?
Absolutely. Yeah, corporates is really interesting. It's an interesting market. Corporates are sitting on a lot of data, but they mostly have data about themselves and not their competitors.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting problem. I mean, no company will want to share information with its competitors, but potentially in an anonymized or aggregated way. So there could be space for alternative data providers to aggregate data up within an industry and provide it to corporates so they can have a view on the competitive landscape, for example, on which companies they are competing with, which companies they want to acquire, how their marketing strategy could be different. I definitely think that's an area of interest.